Okay, welcome everybody to IoT Coffee Talk. Wow, the throngs of people, the cheering, the crowd.
There's just so many. I better be quiet and let everyone else talk.
Oh, I know. I don't want to interrupt anybody. So, yes, as you and I were just chatting about, I'm in Hawaii right now. I'm about to fly home. And so, yeah, a few times a year. So all the stuff we talk about, whether it's connectivity, 5G, the IoT, digital twins, obviously AI is a big topic these days. And so I go do briefings, for senior officers about 3 times a year. And so I just happen to be in Hawaii now and doing an in-person event, which was great. Previous ones, as you can imagine, over the last while, they've just been on Zoom and they're no fun. And so I'm out here at Pearl Harbor and briefing flag officers. And so for you uninitiated people, those would be like your admirals and generals, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Wow.
And so out here, it's commander of the Pacific Fleet. Is the one that we were doing this for. And so, yeah, admirals, generals, 4-stars were here. We had lots of colonels and captains, So just to not confuse you people, if you're in the Navy, a captain is like a colonel, whereas if you're in the Army, a captain would be just like a lieutenant, right? And so it's a different level. And so we had both because, as some people know or don't know, the Marine Corps is part of the Navy, even though they don't want to talk about that. They're kind of independent and kind of part of the Navy, and that's, they all, So, last couple of days, did briefings for the commander of the Pacific Fleet, and all these folks in there, and a bunch of us who are, a lot of instructors from, in fact, I was the only one who was not a doctor. Everyone else was a PhD. So all the real smart people were there, and then there's me. And so, there's a place called the Naval Postgraduate School, and that's in Monterey, California. And so the Naval Postgraduate School kind of facilitates a lot of these events to keep senior officers abreast of what's the newest bleeding edge technology. And so you can imagine how there's stuff that we talk about all the time, but you can, in your head, you can go, how would I reframe the same discussion to enhance the capabilities of war fighters? And I totally get that this probably turns a lot of people off, but oh well, sorry. And so, but it's interesting, and it's interesting when you think about it, because obviously all this technology has multiple purposes, right? We have civilian purposes, but it also has military purposes. And so, obviously I am here to serve the United States, as I always have, and we have adversaries around the world that we have to think about. And of course, do they have access to similar technology? Yes, they do. And so not only do we talk about how our warfighters could be using this technology better to enhance their capabilities, but you also have to think about how would our adversaries use the same technology against us. So it's really interesting. You and I, we talk so much about cellular and stuff like that, and there's the whole notion of spectrum, right? And all these countries do spectrum auctions, and the mobile operators get spectrum and stuff like that. Well, guess who else uses spectrum? The military does, right? And so this is a thing. If you ever heard the term jamming, like, they're jamming my signal, they're jamming, radar and things like, and all kinds of communications, they're running over different frequencies as well. Some news, not big news, but little news in the last few years, I can't speak for any other place, but in the U.S. had to do with the CBRS thing, which is where the government carved off some extra spectrum for companies, for enterprises, so that they wouldn't always have to go to AT&T or T-Mobile or Verizon or Vodafone or whoever and say, hey, can we use this spectrum for our corporate stuff? Because, big corporations, they love to run their own network, and a lot of times they really don't like being beholden to these mobile operators. They're like, yeah, we got this. And so you've probably heard us talk about CBRS over the last several years, where the government carved off some spectrum and there's a mechanism by which an enterprise, a big company, can say, yes, in this 3-mile radius in this location, I want some of that spectrum because I'm going to do private 5G or private LTE, because there's lots of talk about private networks and building that. But you know, the elephant in the room is when you're using cellular technology versus Wi-Fi, for instance, it's licensed spectrum, so you can't just turn it on. And so that's always been the elephant in the room. You've got to, and so in the past, it's not that private LTE is new, but it was harder to sell, because at the end of the sales conversation, after the customer's all excited, then you say, oh, by the way, I need you to call a mobile operator and see if they'll carve off from spectrum for you. And of course, that could be a deal killer, you know. It just depends.
I think it's really interesting, Rob. You know, I mean, opinions aside around defense and military, etc., whether you like it or not, it's going to happen. The investment is there, and it's needed, right? As you say, in other countries and other parts of the world, they surely are doing it. They're putting investment into it. I'm curious to know, like, the level of knowledge in the room when you're giving these talks, right? Because I guess it can be quite different, because, you know, here on IoT Coffee Talk, we can be in our own little bubble sometimes, right? And we can talk about bits and pieces, and perhaps people in the outside world may not necessarily know that, but I don't know, because when you talk in a kind of military defense concept, is it actually quite high compared to, let's say, if you were giving this talk to, you know, a section of people that weren't in the military but weren't also in technology, if that makes sense?
No, that's a good question. Some of the stuff we talked about, these guys may have never heard of it, or they may have read just a small briefing document on it. And that's actually the point of having us come there, because they want outsiders, they want outside candid opinions, and, you know, they want to hear, because guess what? Like you talk about us being in our bubble, they're in a bubble, all kinds of people are in their little bubbles, and all they hear is, and so most of the time they're thinking about, you know, I need an extra, you know, $20 billion so I can buy this new fighter jet, you know, or I need to build a new submarine, or whatever it is. And they're always thinking about weapon systems and stuff like that. But as you know, electronic warfare, you know, the internet changed the game. And so it's not just kinetic battles on a battlefield, it's cyber war. And as many people know, or this may sound freaky to people, there's been an ongoing cyber war, I'd say, for at least 2 decades right now. And I don't want to sound alarmist or anything. You know, when you're surfing the internet, you know, shopping online and some stuff, you don't necessarily see the bullets flying by you on the internet, but they actually are flying by you. There's folks that you've probably heard about, I'm not going to call out any names, who are hacking and trying to get intellectual property or break into things 24/7. That's all that, you know, they're just scouring websites, trying to probe and penetrate, you know, defenses of giant corporations, governments, every government, you know, and and so part of it is espionage and government spycraft. Some of it is trying to grab intellectual property, right, from corporations. And so, which actually, that's an interesting discussion in itself. Because, oh, good, we got David here. Hang on, let me see. Let me get him in here. Yeah, and so to answer your question, yeah, have they ever had any of these admirals or generals ever heard of digital twins before? No, they hadn't. Did they know a little bit about spectrum? Yes, because they actually do have, in certain services, they have people who are now in charge of what you would call EMS, you know, it's an electromagnetic spectrum, you know, and so that's a thing. So, for instance, and again, none of this is classified information, but, you know, when you go around the world, you know, different countries have auctioned off different frequencies, you know, bands for people to do, you know, and obviously David's lived this life, you know, at Verizon. But what's interesting is the military, on the one hand, they may be doing communications with troops on the ground and ships at sea and things like that in the United States one way. But if, let's say, they need to go do an exercise in another country, let's say the U.S. is going to go do a joint exercise with the U.K. or any of our Five Eyes friends, because that's very normal for us to do that together. But in different countries or locations, their EMS, their spectrum might be different. And so you don't want to, step on any toes. And so their gear may be designed to talk at certain frequencies to do things, but they have to check and say, well, in this country, we're using these bands, and so you can't stomp on those bands because it's licensed spectrum for commercial, right? And so there's people who actually have to juggle that and think about that just when they're doing exercises and things around the world, whether it's going to the UK or the Philippines or whatever. Everybody has a thing, and so that's kind of a thing. Of course, what's interesting about that is what happens when the bullets start flying. When, do you still tiptoe around the spectrum and respect different countries' spectrum bands? Or do you say, I don't really care anymore, the gloves are off, right? This is stuff that nobody ever talks about, and it's because it's a strange conversation, obviously. And there's this notion of jamming, right? We've been, going back to World War II, we're jamming radar and stuff like that. All this stuff is just radio waves, right? It really is, and so it's radio waves at different frequencies running at different hertz, how many times are we rotating there per second, right? And so it's an interesting thing, and it's interesting when you talk about, well, if we were in a shooting war with the adversary, we would just start flooding every frequency, because obviously we have software-defined networking. You could have a little box that just goes and just scours every radio frequency and floods it with data or whatever. And you could do that to disrupt your adversary, but guess what? You can't communicate either. And so, there's all this stuff. And so David, we were just chatting. I've just been briefing a bunch of folks here at Pearl Harbor. And so, great. All this was unclassified, but interesting conversations about how we use civilian technology, and for warfighting capabilities, right?
Yeah, some of the definitely commercial concepts, but to your point, this is back. Remember back in the 90s when it's like, hey, so will my 2G phone work in next country, right? And it was what band are you? What frequency? Is it TDMA, CDMA, GSM? What is it? Same applies here. And another thing that you triggered, not that there's much to trigger in my brain nowadays, but recently in the conflict or war, depending which country, the whole Ukraine debacle, we learned that. And I don't know if it was due to signals being jammed, but you effectively had soldiers utilizing the commercial network to communicate with their command, and that didn't pan out for that particular situation. But it's But to your point, if the bullets are flying and my approved communication device is not working, and the bullets are flying, man, I got signal on my Nokia brick.
Yeah,
that I'm going to use to inform. So
that's a great point when you talk about your old Nokia brick.
I'm not taking my iPhone to the trenches. Are you kidding me? I'm going to go in the basement, look for a Nokia 2100 series, and the battery's going to last me, 2 months, easy.
Exactly. So it's part thing. Speaking of old stuff. Let's just talk about the war in Ukraine right now. There's things you're seeing. You just said the word trenches. Warfare is happening there that looks a lot like World War I. There are people in trenches right now, and yet it's like a future shock kind of thing. There's people doing trench warfare just like World War I right now, and yet some people are using consumer drones and flying over people in trenches and having drones drop hand grenades onto them. You could say this is being scrappy or resourceful with what you got, right? there are so many interesting lessons to be learned from what's going on. So often we spend so much money on this super high-end tech for battlefield stuff, weapon systems, whatever. And yet here we are watching this conflict going on, and people are using the DJI. They're just they're drones that they bought for their cameras, and they're using it on the battlefield.
It's economics. It's economics. How many Predator drones could I buy versus let me go down to my hobby shop and just get, hey, what's your DJI stock? I'll take it.
Yes, but this is a great discussion point, because in the end, is it more effective to have swarms of low-cost commercial drones, or spending billions on Predators or Global Hawks or stuff like that? Well, we're getting to see it play out in real life right now, and maybe the answer is off-the-shelf commercial stuff, and lots of them coming from every direction at a tiny, tiny fraction of the cost, right?
Do you know what? That's a really good point. I think, David mentioned it when he spoke about his Nokia, right? When push comes to shove, you use whatever you've got and that you need to get the job done. And if it means it's a Mavic Pro because, hey, I've got one because everyone's got one, then you use it, right? So that's quite an interesting concept. And I guess, even outside of a warfare point of view, that could be applied for so many different instances, doesn't it? You have this kind of view about what you might use and what but the reality of the situation is actually quite different, isn't it?
Absolutely. And also, speaking of World War I, not only doing trench warfare, but everybody's uploading videos of what's going on to YouTube. There's a video of the use of World War I machine guns mounted on like a tripod and being remotely controlled. A modern tech to remotely control a World War I machine gun being used in Ukraine, and it's on YouTube. Who would have thought you'd see something like that?
That's crazy,
dude. You know what? I know next to nothing about weaponry, but to think that, at the end of the day, if this thing is locked and loaded, and I can actuate a trigger, and maybe put some sort of rotary. Yeah, dude, that's super cool.
It's just people being resourceful. Back to, this is all we found. This is what we got. We got to make the best of it. But we're really smart. We're 21st century smart, but maybe we have ancient weapons. That's all we got. And so very clever stuff. But it brings up bigger conversations about what's the best use of taxpayer dollars for weapon systems, right?
And also brings that phrase of, they don't make them like they used to, because if you have a weapon from the First World War and you can still utilize it today, that is a quality crafted thing.
Yes.
Right there.
Yes, exactly. After all the great machines. Go ahead, Tom.
No, I completely agree. I think it's also a lot of posturing, isn't there? Right? Because clearly, one side doesn't have what they've said that they've had or claim that they've had over the years, right? And if they're still using all of this, and there's clearly a bit of a problem there. So yeah, totally. It's I think it all boils down to what's right and what's going to get you out of stuck the quickest, basically. And I think that's the main concept here. So much money can be spent on, we talk about drones, etc., and but what's actually going to do the job there and then,
Yeah, absolutely.
I heard that the Putin demo day last week didn't go so well. He only had like a little tank or something. I don't know. I didn't quite read everything, but it wasn't like previous demo days. It was kind of like Mobile World Congress, like pre-COVID, and then the first one right out. It just wasn't the same.
Kind of the light version.
Yeah.
My God.
I hear the KGB doing something to my router right now.
They're coming for you. Exactly. Isn't that interesting? But yeah, so EMS, the spectrum in different scenarios. You could flood every frequency, but then you still have to communicate, obviously, yourself. You can imagine the need to dynamically switch and hop to different frequencies to communicate if your adversary is jamming a particular one, right? And so that's a thing you have to contend with. Everything's easy in peacetime and training and going, oh, this works great. It's just like a lot of people might say, yeah, military, you should use 5G. It's going to rock and it's going to be awesome. Right up until that moment when it's not, right? And then what do you do next? What's all your backup plan? And maybe it is your brick phone, your Nokia, things like that, or whatever, something that still works, Obviously satellites play a big role in all this. I mean, so like this is IoT Coffee Talk. What's the number one thing you'll hear about people in a battlefield situation, a theater of war, is situational awareness is the number one thing they want. Well, what's the one thing we know that is born to give people situational awareness? IoT. You've got sensors telling you what's going on everywhere in real time. And so that's why IoT is important for this, because people I need to know what's going on everywhere, not just intelligence, not just people, but sensors all over the place. And so IoT plays a growing critical role in this kind of stuff, because that's what it does. It gives you situational awareness. Because from there, then they can make decisions. Like when we talk about what's an IoT platform do, it's discovering, it's measuring, it's sensing things, and then it's deciding to do something. It's taking an action or whatever. And so folks will take actions based on the battlefield awareness. What are those things they call there? Oh, they call it command and control in the military. And so do we. We call it a feature of an IoT platform is command and control. I need to push a message back to my thing to change its behavior, to do something, an actuator, right? Or in Ukraine, maybe I'm going to actuate a World War I machine gun remotely that's sitting on a tripod that maybe I use for my high-end camera.
I think by next, there will be like some weapons manufacturer executive watching this next week, and they're going to come up with a slogan that goes about, if you can see it, we can bomb it. IoT, right? Just right there.
Yeah, absolutely.
But jokes aside, right? If you cannot see it, you cannot manage it, and if you cannot manage it, you cannot make this decision. So it's back to situational awareness, and also the difference if you have command in one part of the theater, right? Versus like, no, this is what's happening right here, right now, no latency, real time. That same information is going to be utilized wildly different based on because now it's tactics versus strategy on one side. So no, this is definitely IoT all over it.
That is. It's tailor-made for IoT, no doubt about it. How often have we said little one-liners like IoT makes the unseen seen, it makes the unknown known? It really brings things to life out there, and so it makes perfect sense. So often we spend here talking about factories and stuff like that, but
does this mean that Colin Powell didn't know about IoT because he gave us the unknown knowns or something like that?
That was right. Don Rumsfeld, actually.
Wrong defense guy.
But they work together, obviously. Colin Powell was a legitimate general, and Rumsfeld was the Secretary of Defense. But you're right. I remember him standing up there going, there are no knowns, and there's unknown unknowns, and there's none unknowns. And it sounded silly, like some kind of word salad.
I think also because we influence so much of the internet, a bunch of kids are going to look up who these two guys are. Look them up. Yes. Donald Rumsfeld, Colin Powell. Books have been written by and about him.
Absolutely. I'm definitely a fan of General Powell. What a great man he was. Oh, my gosh.
Do you know what? It kind of makes me wonder how desperate that situation is. Because if you think about the millions and billions, certainly that from a UK's perspective, looking at the US from what we see, because obviously it's quite closed door, it's ultra secret, it's military, it's defense spending, but we always see reports of billions and billions of investment spent on future warfare. But how is it that in a modern conflict in Ukraine at the moment, it's so desperate compared, right? And I made that earlier point around the posturing, like Russia posturing, sort of saying we've got this, we've got that, against what was its kind of main adversary in the US, but it's clearly completely separate, isn't it? It's like how can it be so desperate that you've got to use World War One equipment?
Absolutely, no, you're absolutely right. It's obviously there's lots of countries like the U.S. and the U.K. and others that have been sending weapons to the Ukrainians to help them, and of course we hear Zelensky all the time saying, "I need more, I need it now, I need it faster." Right? We hear that a lot, and so I think it varies. Obviously, without getting into great details about the weapon systems the U.S. has sent them, which the HIMARS rocket launcher, there's a lot of stuff that has really made a big difference for them. But like anything in life, I think where you are, it varies by where you are in the timing. Sometimes you've got a big hammer and you're doing a great job. Zelensky did some great stuff with the weapons we sent them early on. Instead of using the missiles to just shoot at the Russians the whole time or right at them, a more clever thing was they shot at all their trucks and munitions depots and oil tanks and stuff like that. Because if you can take out the supply chain and your ability to wage a war over a distance, it makes it tough for your adversary. And so there was a lot of clever stuff there. I totally get the desperation. It always feels like it's never enough. There's always we don't want to be too involved. We're going to arm you so you can do your thing. And, and people keep talking about at what point are we escalating where it's really us versus them, that whole deal. And, we keep moving that line. We keep saying, well, we're not going to give you this weapon because then, and then we kind of give it to them, or we can't give you these tanks because if we do that, oh boy. And now they're asking for F-16 fighter jets, and I can get some people saying, well, F-16 seems like a cool plane, but it's actually from the 70s, actually. And so it's like, do we feel like we could give them that, to go against whatever the most recent MiG fighters from the Russians have? I don't know. This is all weird stuff to even talk about on this show, but yet here we are doing it. And so, but all this technology that we live in plays a role in this other world that we don't see day to day, And
I think that's a really interesting point, right? You just don't see it, so you don't know it. Certainly every IoT Coffee Talk that I've been on, every podcast I've produced, we've never really spoken about it. But there must be a whole other ecosystem evolving and growing, from a military and defense side, And again, opinions aside for a moment, because it's going to happen regardless, right, of what viewers may think. It's money's being spent anyhow. But it's an interesting topic to kind of see where it can go, what it can do from a purely technological point of view,
Yeah, absolutely.
No, but it's back to look. I mean, we can bundle in the weapons industry because guess what? They are a manufacturer, right?
One of the biggest manufacturers.
Yes, absolutely. And their ecosystem. It's kind of like if we picked apart. Let's just grab like Toyota and Honda, and then they just do GM and Ford, and we all know it is a couple of thousand parts per vehicle if they have an ICE engine. But when you look at tier 2, it's like, oh wait, you do that for them and these guys, and tier 3, it's nearly identical, on the military side, but obviously for good reasons, crazily heavily regulated. Like if you want to talk about supply chain visibility, go talk to someone who's making a nuclear sub that Rob used to cook his breakfast on that engine, or a weapons manufacturer. Because now you're talking about national defense, not whether my Roomba lost an extra brush today or not. We don't really care about that. It's super complex, super regulated. and not only is it high tech going into the finished product, but basically from raw materials before that thing ships out. It's amazing. It's super cool space to be in. No opinions, right? Just manufacturing, weapons, business,
Absolutely.
supply chain.
The same Boeing that's building you commercial aircraft is building military stuff. And you got Lockheed Martin, you've got Northrop Grumman, you've got Raytheon, General Dynamics, Electric Boat, and they're working around the clock. And it's people working in factories just like the smart factories we talk about. But they're just building something else,
Yeah.
And so back to like some of the just kind of the general stuff around some of the discussions here in Pearl Harbor is, they want to know from us. They want to know from Silicon Valley. They want to know from people in the tech industry. They want to hear other opinions. They don't want to just hear stuff from PhDs from the RAND Corporation. They want to hear other voices because they need our help. They want to make sure they're not in a bubble, right? When we come up with new innovations that could be a game changer in their world, they want to know about it. And then they want to know how can we, and yeah, those frank discussions, it's like, wow, the whole deal is like, okay, we need some kind of new capability, for some kind of drone. All right, I'm going to call Lockheed and I'm going to have to send them $15, million or $1 billion for them to build a prototype. And then I'll get that in however many years or whatever. Or I'm just going to go to the hobby store and buy a drone and drop grenades off of it. And they're like, because remember, what do we always talk about with IoT and all this stuff? The outcome is what matters. And you work back to the technology. And so it's so easy to get caught up in the technology or a particular aircraft or weapon system. But what's important is to walk backwards and say, the outcome we're seeing in Ukraine is, wow, they sure are having a lot of luck with these toy drones and all kinds of other scrappy, find whatever you can get kind of things that didn't cost that kind of money. And is there a lesson to be learned there? Maybe there is, maybe less is more, smaller things might be better than big things.